Hi, everyone. It's Wednesday, October 4th. Thanks for joining Season 1 of Radio Free XP. Today, I'm joined by Dwayne Forde. Dwayne, give us a quick summary of what we're going to talk about.
I'd love to take people through my developer journey. After spending 20 years in writing code, I've had a good amount of time not pairing and pairing. I'd love to tell people how the shift in the mindset has led us to create some industry-changing software, get some really good outcomes in terms of companies and business, and then tell people a little bit about the new thing I'm doing.
All right, Dwayne. Well, let's get on the pairing journey. You said at the top you spent a lot of time solo. So, tell us a little bit about your solo career and how did you discover pairing?
Yeah, I had a non-traditional way of getting into the engineering scene. I kind of just picked up a C++ book in high school and just essentially just started doing it. I always had a lot of empathy for users because my initial users were actually my parents. They had their own business. They had a lot of logistical pain, and my mom was using a lot of spreadsheets. I picked up C++. I quickly learned PHP and told them I could solve some of their problems, and I kind of never just stopped doing that. But back in those days, learning coding was a lot of IRC, reading books, kind of just trial and error. It was a very slow learning process because you're kind of on your own, and there was like this text community, but that you can kind of ask for questions, but they'd never be in the same context, in the same mind space, solving the same problem with you. It wasn't until I joined Extreme Labs, and that's a story in itself because I always say they kind of tricked me into a job. But they tricked me essentially with with pairing. I didn't want a job at the time. They told me just to come in anyways. And when I saw the energy around people pairing, and also other skilled people just working together so closely, it was almost impossible for me to resist, especially at that stage of my career where I was just like so hungry for just learning more and observing more and working with very cool clients. So,
all right. And so what was that? One of the things that I really want to articulate for anyone who might want to listen is, what was it like to go from solo to pairing? What was that first 4 weeks like?
It felt like what I would have learned on my own in like 6 months to a year. I was learning like every week. Like it was such like an up ramp of just like, hey, to do this thing on AWS, on my own, I would have tried a few different techniques. Like, what about this? What about that? Or like, I don't really have a game plan here. And then pairing with folks is like, oh no, we've tried a few things. This is how we do it here. We can always talk about that process, but like, we got this kind of like down. And you're just like, instead of like sifting around in the dark, you almost have like a little bit of a guiding light. And not like an authoritative kind of like, just do it this way. It was a back and forth conversation of like, hey, we can move this. We've been here before. We're sharing our experiences. We can kind of move through these problems faster.
Yeah. So I just want to, you're talking about doing 6 months worth of learning in about a week. Did I get that correct?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So that's a 24x speed up. So if I break it down like that and I say that to you, hey, in pairing, you got a 24, and that was your first 4 weeks. Is that how you would describe it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the first 4 weeks, you got a 20 times speed up plus.
Yeah. And I was also going from, when I was working by myself, I was full PHP. God bless myself. I subjected myself to 5 years of hardcore PHP without any frameworks. And then in Extreme Labs, when they were pairing, it was mobile work, but it was also a lot of Ruby on Rails. And they're essentially, in a weekend, we need you to learn Ruby on Rails and start on Monday. So I read a book as fast as I can, but until you do a larger projects on any code base, you never really know how to approach things, right? Like the book gets you to day one, I can start compiling things. But it was really pairing that made me effective within the first week, right? Like absorbing all that knowledge, absorbing the practices, and just working with people. Yeah, it was a great, I mean, it continues to be a great experience, but especially for on-ramping, I can never praise pairing highly enough.
Yeah, I'm gonna go a little bit behind because you had to bring a lot of people into pairing because you were in leadership and management both at Extreme and Pivotal, and so your experience sounds like you were just fluent instantly. And that's another thing people should know about you is that you were recruited to professional hockey as a teenager, and you are also a competitive gamer, a competitive esports guy, right? So the thing that's always just blown me away about you is just how quickly you seem to become fluent with anything. And you have this absolutely just comfort. It doesn't seem to be effort for you, right? And, maybe behind the scenes it is effort. But what was your experience when you brought people into pairing? What was their 4 weeks like? What would you prep them for?
What would I prep them for? I think because of the hiring practices that we had at Extreme Labs and Pivotal, I kind of knew that people had the core skills and kind of approach for pairing to make them successful. So I kind of attribute my agility for a lot of different things to coming up with or learning engineering through C++. Like, it's just very challenging. There's a lot of things that you can kind of get into trouble with. So when you kind of learn a lot of the fundamental coding patterns, concepts, and everything else, like jumping around to different languages, it's more about the syntax than the fundamental learning. I feel like the Pivotal and Extreme Labs kind of hiring process tested that fundamental learning to a certain extent, to the point where people could be flexible. And then from there on, it's more about the person and how open they are to communicating, right? Communicating clearly, effectively, and really working with that person next to them to get the best outcome out of the problem they're trying to solve.
Yeah. So I was never familiar with the Extreme Labs hiring process, but many people who are listening will be familiar with the RPI. What was Extreme's process?
It was very similar. Extreme Labs modeled itself after Pivotal Labs very, very closely.
Wise thing to do. Okay, and so again, you've been on both sides of the table, individual developer all the way up to founder and exit and things like that. Is there any so? I'm assuming that pairing for you and generally the XP model that's the model you choose when you have a choice. Is that right?
Yep.
What's the next best model to you? What's the thing that you've seen that's effective?
I mean, our group right now, for me, I kind of model the approach based off of the composition of the group. So in a high growth situation where a group is kind of constantly bringing in new people, you can have I found that you can have the best documentation in the world. People don't like to read, right? Like, especially when your code base gets really, really large. Like, the people will definitely look up specific things, but I have tried so many different initiatives with, Notion and, VMware, we had Confluence, Pivotal. I tried to do something with Google Sites, something to index and search and everything else. And I feel like AI is going to help with that a lot, help indexing and understanding. But nothing beat, just having somebody pair on the code. For our group specifically, because we are 11 people, they're all ex-Pivots and Extreme Labs folks, very seasoned engineers. There'll be some times where we pair on the approach that we're going to take. And then sometimes people will split up to accomplish that work and then come back together again. So a little bit of a hybrid model, but still mostly pairing.
Awesome. Well, your journey into pairing was so smooth, and it's just fantastic to hear. And I don't know, what would you say to someone out there who is considering, hey, I want to try to find a pairing role? How would you recommend that they prep? You know, we'll work to publicize companies that do pair XP style, but if this is if someone's listening who's like, well, how would I get into this? What would you tell them to prep for?
That's a good question. I would say if they needed to, or they felt like they needed to build up on these particular like communicative skills, learn how to really articulate the sometimes very complex problem that you're trying to solve in either a tech stack or a piece of code. The better you communicate your ideas to a group, the better they all understand it, and the better like a pairing group who's going to have a lot of empathy and want to help out each other, the better you are articulating the problem you're trying to solve. And you might need to do that for different people in different ways at different times. The better off you'll be, the better your pair experience is going to be, and the more open you are to listening, right? I've seen people have very strong opinions, strongly held, and that you don't get the best out of a pairing group when people are doing that.
Anything else you'd want to tell people about pairing? Are you hiring?
Yeah, I'd say like we're trying to keep our group fairly lean, but we're always looking at what the next hire looks like. In terms of other groups that are pairing, yeah, we know a bunch of groups that are still pairing and a bunch who aren't. There's also the whole like in office and remote. So there's a lot of different factors to choosing a place these days. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of folks who are big fan of pairing, and I don't see them switching off anytime soon.
All right, I'll round this whole thing out with your experience is you are 20 times more effective. And so if you're speaking to a founder, maybe not a technical founder or even a technical founder who's only soloed, what would you say to that founder about how to adopt this model? And so, maybe you're a special case and maybe 20x is not the right way to think about it. But for the average person who goes from solo programming to pairing, my experience is they experience a 5 to 10x. Just notable right away. They could say, when I walked in the door, I was value 1. Today, I'm value 6. Like that, in 6 months, you hear that. So if you're trying to convince founders or financial people or people in business who might be looking for a big bump in human productivity, what would you say to them about pairing or in XP in general?
The way I kind of look at it is this, and like I've had maybe way too much time to think about this throughout the pivotal journey and how we did resourcing and allocations there, and then again as a founder. And the way I kind of look at it is, well, the group is getting kind of large. There's getting to be, we start with the pairing schedule, but without it, there becomes like knowledge silos. So I'm like, okay, if I'm a founder and I'm looking at my group and, people are working on, different things, but I want to keep people in sync so we don't, deliver the wrong thing or get stuck because of, one team's not talking to another and everything else. And even in a small group, working in the same office, that can just happen, and that happens naturally. If I'm not pairing, how do I mitigate that risk? It's like, well, okay, I need to hire like another TPM, or everybody needs to double down like really hard on documentation, or we need to take more time out of the day, just to demo to each other or anything else. And when I think about all of those options versus pairing just seems to be the most cost-effective way to keep everybody in sync, everybody in the same mental flow, as in like worrying about the same problems at the same time, which is very, very, very important. Especially to a small group like us, if one person has a misconception on, what we should be focusing on, which layer of the stack, which UI components we're working on for that week, like that week is a huge time loss for us. So keeping the group in sync is a really, large, high priority. It means that if I talk to one person, I know it's going to permeate through the group. I don't have to, keep on pulling the whole group into a meeting over and over and over again. And that's the way I see it. The cost savings outweigh the fact that you kind of have like two people working on the same thing. And I feel like a lot of founders kind of like really struggle with that aspect. I'm like, oh, you feel like I have half the capacity. I think even at Pivotal, we would explain to folks like, yeah, in the short term, you might have a productivity gain for that first week, but then all these little gremlins and smells will show up, in the first month or two and everything else. And you'll start getting some losses like, oh, this other team was working in a way. Now we need to refactor it and dial back. So.
Yeah, I have the story that I was told when I came in is like, look, a superstar programmer will run circles around a paired team for 3 to 6 months. And then the weight of just cognitively managing the overhead of the thing that they have written, especially without testing, will start to drag their productivity down. And what I saw was that a team that's only got 2,000 hours a year essentially to work together was legitimately effective 6 hours a day, 200 working days a year.
Yep.
And this is something that it's so challenging to communicate to a technical founder or a finance person who wants to think about, well, why would I use nominally 2 resources? And you think that's 2 resources on one thing. It's like, gosh, I wish it were easy to calculate. Like it doesn't work like that though.
Yeah, it's almost like you have to kind of see what the long tail outcomes of both are to kind of gauge, which one you should do. I feel like we have the benefit of that experience. Not everybody does. So it's really hard to get that experience across sometimes. But also it's just like, if you have that superstar coder, just the social dynamics of that working style, right? Like one person running off, the other person not knowing why all these decisions were made. They didn't have any say in it. Then you kind of have like this back and forth where people are kind of like, working against each other in terms of making decisions and having to go back. And nobody likes doing that. It adds up to a lot of little things.
Yeah. Yeah. My experience here is that the hardest thing to do in a business to keep things really going is to keep aligned. Hey, this quarter we're going to do X, Y, Z. And then like next week, someone is doing A, B, C. And the model, the full XP model, keeps an alignment like almost nothing can. I have never seen anything that is that aligning. And yeah, accounting right now just doesn't have a way to measure alignment, which is a big problem.
Yeah, I actually I talked to an executive at a company. I knew them from VMware, and they ended up joining as a VP as another company, and there was a big leadership turnover. And he said for the next 6 to 8 months, he would randomly get these messages from people or sometimes full teams saying they're like, hey, I'm done. And he'd be like, who are you? Because they were never like tracked. They were never like in sync. Like it'd be like individuals just working off in the corner and just soloing and running with it. And then coming out of nowhere, and he'd be like, oh, you weren't even being tracked. I'd have no idea where you kind of came from, and having to get them back into alignment.
Yeah, that's such a classic problem, especially when you don't have the alignment. You get people who are very well-intentioned and maybe even high capacity running off on a certain direction that pleases them and seems to be what everyone is asking for. But that is chaos, even with really good people. That's chaos within a few weeks.
Yeah,
all right.
I can definitely ramble on for hours about the benefits and
yeah.
the limits sometimes of pairing. So I'd love to go anywhere that you want to go, or say
let's hit Mantle, right? So this is by pivots for pivots. What the heck are you up to?
Mantle. So it's really interesting. I thought company equity was more of like a solved problem. And I remember in Extreme Labs, when I joined, they would be like, hey, you have these options. And they would kind of just give me an email or a PDF. And that was it. There's no portal, no anything. I didn't have many questions because I was early on in my career. And I'm like, I don't know what this is. It sounds good. They said it could be worth something later on, but who knows? I don't know. It seems like fictitious. And then as I started learning about options and everything else, I'm like, okay, there has to be like a better system for this. I became a manager. I was helping issue options and everything else. And like, I didn't fully understand, but I'm like, okay, these are important. People need to know about them. So before the Pivotal acquisition, we got UBS and we got like a tracking system, but the equity for how it was doled out to employees and how to track it and your run rate with all that stuff, it was all done in spreadsheets. And then we got to Pivotal, and I'm like, okay, Pivotal's a larger company. We have to be doing something a little bit more structured here. It was still spreadsheets that would output to, eventually Workday, and we used UBS for a little bit, and then we jumped to like Charles, and then at EMC, I think we moved to E-Trade, I don't know, or it was VMware. But throughout all these processes, and even at some of these larger companies, I saw a lot of spreadsheets to plan out something that's really important, which is, options and equity going to employees. And, when I left VMware, I was actually tapped on the shoulder by, many different companies. And because I know to ask this question now, I would ask the founders of like, hey, what does your cap table look like? Like what kind of decisions have you been making for the company at this level? Because I know how important that is now. I know if I'm going to join a company, it's going to be for the long run. I want to see where this could possibly end up. And I would see like a lot of the companies that I actually wanted to join, I would see their cap tables be like completely obliterated by a bad round or a founder who kind of ran off with a bunch of equity. And all these different scenarios where I'm just like, oh, geez, like this is actually a really bad setup. I don't know how a company gets out of this. And it all led up to companies making early decisions in their financial journey that they didn't quite understand. So that's why we're building Mantle. No more spreadsheets. You can put in your cap table, all of your stakeholders, all the safes, all the convertibles. We give you the calculators and the planning tools to make all of those decisions a lot easier, and take out a bunch of human error out of those situations.
And so does it also make it easier for someone who's receiving an equity award? Like, can I track over time, what the dilution is? Do I have a running total of, what percentage I have, things like that?
Yeah. So we're building out that view soon. Right now it's just the company side. We want to build out that side. An interesting part of that is how that gets presented to the employee. Right? It's a very nuanced conversation that we're still kind of like sifting through. Because I feel like, even at Pivotal, it was presented to us in like a few different ways. And like, which way do you want to talk about it? Might depend on the market and everything else. I don't know. It's up to companies to choose how they want to do that with their employees. But we definitely want to have all the tools for the employees to go through like, okay, these are the different exit scenarios. This is what I have. I could plan these things out and ultimately track the performance of the company year over year. We'll give you that whole history as they go through different valuations and everything else. A lot more powerful on that side. And we're putting in all the protections to make sure that they're not putting in like their work emails and stuff like that. I had that happen once or twice. So like I can't log in anymore. I don't even know where this, like if I have money or options anymore. Like we definitely want to make that whole side a lot better for folks.
Gosh, it sounds like you're paying attention to what users might need and the situations they might find themselves in.
I've been through the pain. It's really easy to lose track of this stuff. So,
yeah. Well, what stage are you guys in? I think you mentioned you're at 14 folks working.
We're at 11, and then we do the co-op program through Waterloo as well. So we're always accepting some co-ops from there.
Great, and you're in Toronto.
Yep.
So where are you at in your go-to-market And where are you looking to land with this company?
Well, we just publicly launched yesterday. We got featured on TechCrunch, which is awesome. We're just trying to onboard as many companies as possible. I just talked to a customer right before this. This is why I was a minute late. And they were running a fund, and they're like, we need something to track all of our company's things. It's all in spreadsheets. We're like, okay, yeah, well, going through an auditing process, and they don't have the history. So we're definitely going to help them out with that. But yeah, we're in the process of just onboarding as many companies as possible who need help with this.
Well, you have a specialized audience here. So how many companies do you want to onboard? What's your price point today?
We're doing for everybody who signs up in this early stage of the company. It's free for the first year. It's going to depend on company size, but generally the companies that are signing on are fairly small. So it'll be about $100 per month.
Okay, here in October 2023, for a short while, you can sign up for free cap table management and then continue on at a pretty reasonable price on a monthly basis for what's a huge labor-saving device, and also completely quashes a huge amount of thrash, which is just not good for anyone. It's back to aligning, right? It's a high alignment product.
Yeah, I definitely, a founder has to think about so many things any given day. It's really easy to put the equity, like auditing and tracking, in the back burner until it becomes a problem. We're just helping people get on that journey early so they don't have that problem later on. So yeah, we're just happy to have people sign on whenever they're comfortable, but hopefully before they run into any trouble.
All right, well, let's make sure we get the contact information out there. The company is called Mantle. Where exactly do they find you?
Go to withmantle.com.
Withmantle.com.
Mm-hmm.
And right now it's free for Lighthouse customers. That's
Sure.
Okay, so if you're listening, you can solve a huge problem from people who are super good at software and really understanding users' needs. You can get that problem solved for free for the next however long you're doing this intro. So if you're listening, you should definitely just go sign up. If you have a company, you want to do business with Dwayne Forde, I'll just tell you that.
Thanks. That means a lot coming from you. It really does.
Yeah, well, so, we can wrap on that if there's nothing else to say about Mantle, and we can definitely go, off-roading here in terms of, the kind of conversations that we usually have.
Oh, yeah.
It's called Radio Free XP for a reason, right? There's sometimes some things you need to get taken care of. But yeah, take your jacket off, right?
Taking the hoodie off thing.
Yeah,
we're going deep.
It's gonna get it warm in here. So, we worked directly together as directors on Cloud Foundry, and we were in meetings weekly together. We had different focuses, but we were working that. And so the thing about you is that you got the pivotal assumption set of leadership the same way you're like, oh yeah, I showed up and I was 20 times more effective in my first 4 weeks. Like, that's just Dwayne Forde. Like, that's it. And so management, I just never saw you make a misstep. I never saw like a big blunder. I never saw, what I guess what I'm really saying is I didn't ever see a situation where something happened and you freaked out. You're like, okay, well, this thing has happened. There's probably a way to progress through this. And so many of our conversations have been on really the basics of leadership, because I think for many people you're the favorite mentor, and so I was always very curious about how did you develop that. From my point of view, I look at it like, if you're good at sports, if you're good at not just good at a sport, like if you're recruitable at the professional level in a sport, you must deeply understand something. And so, that intro is a way to ask, how you're here now, how do you look at leadership? Do you subscribe to any particular theory? Or what are you following along for your leadership model?
That's a good question. First of all, I think you flatter me.
Wouldn't just be me. Wouldn't
I
just
think
be me.
I definitely had many missteps, and I think a lot of people in our industry, and I think a lot of different businesses, not just our industry. I feel like a lot of folks get nudged into management with not a lot of preparation or support sometimes. So I've always been super empathetic for like other folks coming into the role. Like I'll make as much time as possible for any of you. I've evolved to have like 1 or 2 courses and materials that have people like really accelerate through it, but just giving people the time. So I think I've had a lot of missteps, but I've always put in 10x the effort to fix those missteps, and I think people really appreciate that. Right? I never want to project that I am perfect or anybody that kind of needs to be perfect. But we can always come together and solve a solution no matter what it is. I think, even in my own family, I kind of, I'm kind of treated as the crisis person. Like if anything goes wrong, like Dwayne will just like show up, be there, be calm, and like know how to handle the situation. Even though like, not to say that I have the answers, but I'll be able to show up and be like, okay, how do we solve this? Like, let's go through the steps and like go through it. I attribute it a lot to hockey and the gaming stuff. I feel like I've been in so many high pressure situations where the stakes were like really, really high within like seconds, to the point where when a lot of like business problems come up, I'm like, I understand that this is actually like a thing, and everybody has like in high tension right now, but I always compare that to like flying off a ramp and missing the speed and not knowing where you're going to land. Like those like 10 to like 5 to 10 seconds where you're hovering in the air and you don't know where to land, like the amount of anxiety and self-reflect and like
Wait, are you an expert at some other sport I don't know? Because I totally forgot to mention race car driving.
oh, race car driving, not as much, but I did a bunch of I've always done a bunch of like half pipe kind of stunt kind of things, and I did crashed ice, which is where you go down a ski hill, but it's covered in ice, and they put ramps there, and it's a race. So I've always been into like a little bit of the extreme sport side, and yeah, you're eventually going to run into a case where you're, whether you're skiing or doing the crashed ice, or I was on rollerblades at times where you just don't gauge your speed properly and you don't know where you're going to land, and it might be painful. So in terms of like really like critically assessing a situation in like 5 seconds versus like when a business scenario comes up and we're like, okay, let's sit down for an hour and sort it out. I feel very calm in those situations because I feel like I've been in some kind of like life-threatening situations that put it into perspective.
I'm gonna dump one of the management models that I use, which is the 5 T's. It's talent, temperament, time, tools, and training.
Right.
Time, tools, and training you can supply to people, but talent and temperament are hard to supply. This is in the sports arena, you cannot coach speed. And so I guess when you say that, like, you're the calm one, that's what I'm reading. Like, I just never, maybe you messed up a lot and bad, I don't know. But your temperament around it was always, well, it's just calming, right? And again, when we popped out to Pivotal, what I observed about Pivotal is there was always a method to handle whatever happened. It's like, the team is lost. Okay, do a reinception in a minimum, just see, right?
Yeah.
Or any of these, other ways that we had for aligning teams. We were talking with David Lang earlier today, and there were pivots that I counted on to be able to realign teams. Yeah, and so that's another temperament and talent thing. You when you found that.
Yeah, and I attribute a lot of I kind of rely on, or I think I built up a lot of muscle memory around team building when it came to hockey. Like, the fundamental understanding, like as a kid, that like, no, a successful team isn't a whole bunch of you, right? Like your hockey, like you need a goalie, you need a defenseman, you need like all these different roles on a hockey team or any sports team. I played a few different team sports. I'm just like, no, you're not the most important thing there. You can't be the most important thing there. You have to work with people. It's actually more fun when you work with people and it all works in harmony. Everybody knows their role. Everybody's in sync on like what you're trying to accomplish. Like it's a very, when all that gets to the right level of understanding and everybody's there and you're kind of, like mid-season, everybody knows, like everything just clicks and everybody is like a beautiful symphony of execution that's happening in a sport when that goes well.
Yeah, and I never played team sports at all, and I was definitely a Lone Ranger kind of solo guy. And my first real deep experience with working on a team and having the experience you're having, like, oh my gosh, this is clicking. Oh my gosh, this is like a billion times funner than, trying to grind it alone. I love that about Pivotal. I mean, I think maybe at the top of this, we talked about the career-changing nature of going to Pivotal, and for me, it was absolutely career-changing. Like my career didn't like jump tracks; it jumped dimensions.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah, as we've always talked about teams, like so a Pivotal team was roughly the same size as a hockey team. Like how many? I don't know anything about hockey. How many people are on the ice at one time?
5.
And how many people are on the bench what makes up a hockey team in general?
In general, so I mean, you'll have 5 players on the ice. You'll have 1 goalie, right? You have 2 defensemen, 3 kind of forward, and then you'll have like an extra 2 or 3 lines of people on the bench. A lot of the times, you'll have the person who's playing center. If you don't have enough players, they have to double up. So I think that's the only reason I have a good cardiovascular system is I was playing center on a lot of my teams. And when other players would have another like shift to rest, I would have to rest and go out with the very next line. So I trained myself to, kind of skate really hard, get calm really fast, skate really hard, get calm really fast, get to do it twice as quick as others.
You're tuned by sports for the iteration model at Pivotal, right? Like it's just. Yeah.
There's a lot of like weird analogies. I think like a long time ago, I heard about like all these tech companies hiring like football players and stuff like that. I was like, why are they doing that? And then like throughout my career, I'm like, it starts making a little bit more sense, like the whole like team methodology and everything else. I will say that like going back to the team analogy, I do realize that with every persona, there are pros and cons. So like for me, I'm calm about everything, but it also means I'm bad at celebrating. And like as a group, you definitely should celebrate your wins. And I recognize that like I sometimes just miss those marks. So when I'm looking to round out my a group, I'm just looking at the personalities, whether the deficiencies. So like I know part of my group, we have a few people who are really good at celebrating. Like, hey, let's take a second at like, hey, we did something really cool there. I'm like, oh yeah. Right?
I don't think I'm very good at that. How do you identify someone who's good at celebrating?
I think those people have really valued like them looking at the group and being like, hey, no, something really cool happened here. Let's take a second. Right. I'm generally a person who's like, go. Like what's on to the next problem? I think that's the other problem of being the person who can kind of go into a lot of different situations. I had 1 or 2 employers who would be like, hey, you're now the firefighter. You go to all the worst projects. You are fixing everything, which is always something I, after being through it, I very much was very cognizant of when becoming a leader, making sure that doesn't happen to other people. But yeah, a team needs to be well balanced, and it's not always going to be about one person. So, and I think the pairing model kind of emphasizes that too. Like, you're not going to sit down and solo. You're going to work with these other folks, and we're all going to solve this together. And the balancing of all the views is what's going to be the best outcome.
Yeah. All right. So leadership is certainly one of the things we talk about. Thanks for like tying it together with sports, and if you're into sports and into tech, drop us a line. I want to shift to some of the other things that you have done. So you did take a swing through Web3, right?
Yep.
And then we are for sure at the foot of a revolution here. So I'd love to hear your summary take on Web3. Where are we at? Where did we go wrong? Is it going anywhere?
I think so. I'm not a gambling man, but Web3 had a really good opportunity to disrupt a lot of financial rails. Maybe about a year or two ago. But what has happened is a lot of large financial organizations have pretty much set up their own networks, their own private Ethereum networks to make themselves more efficient. So that when I saw Web3, I was like, oh, a distributed ledger that would keep everything aligned. It sounds like the software that gets sold to banks for millions or they build in-house, right, has now become open source. And that to me in my head is almost like, well, anybody who wants to make a fintech, it's now analogous to when, MySQL or Postgres became open source. Now, if I want to make a bit of software, I don't have to think about, data at rest and how I'm going to query it and everything else. It unlocks a new level of productivity for everybody, and everybody's solution like jumps up a level. Web3 had that opportunity to do that, enable a whole bunch of like fintechs and people to quickly plug into a very viable financial system that could plug into major rails and provide a whole new wave of innovation. What has ended up happening is these private networks run by, banks. They essentially wanted to keep their control, regulatory and safety and, just overall control, which, in hindsight, it's like, yeah, they're never going to want to give that up. And they've used that to open up flexibility a little bit in their systems, but they've mostly used it to keep themselves more organized. So I think JPMC has an example of how they use Web3 to coordinate with other banks to make sure that, fraud is not so fraught in their system. They had some website or stats on their website. They're like, hey, throughout a typical day, they're transacting through how many billions or trillions, and how many of that is fraud just from JPMC not being able to talk to another bank, and they have to sort that out. Now they're using Web3 to just keep all that in check.
So I hadn't ever heard this take that that radically enables a fintech, and I had certainly never heard the take that there's essentially a whole new easy button, for lack of a better term. Are there good examples to point to of people who have taken advantage of that?
I would say if you look at the fundraising platforms that are on Web3, I think they get close to that model. They're like, hey, here's a new way of, contributing money to an initiative that you had before. You don't have to worry about wires. You don't have to worry about, transacting money from one to the other. Just do it on Web3, load up Ethereum, and just do it. It all gets a lot easier. I think where this is all going to land is all the big banks are going to do their own private networks. They're going to keep their control but become more efficient. And the open Web3 world is going to feel more like a Western Union, where people can send money to each other a lot easier. But the stuff that is tied to your bank account and major funds is going to be on private networks. It seems to be that's happening in Brazil right now, and everybody else seems to be following that model.
Okay, well, I have now we'll really go off road. So one of the things is that pivots and people who are deeply into XP, they understand the world a certain way. And like I said, I regard your temperament where hey, there are problems, but there are good models for working. I regard that as so valuable. You just it's so hard to find outside, and it's so easy to find inside the pivotal model. So a big point of doing this whole podcast is to start to rehydrate that network of people who know how to think together. And So I'm a strong believer. I'm a believer in alignment, and I'm a believer in high trust systems. High trust systems have very little friction, and you can take risks and you can do deals, and so how would we essentially wire together all of the pivots? Just imagine every pivot who is working as a consultant independently, something like that. And what we really want to do is you talked about, you can form a team, and that team is moving in a week and not just moving a little, right? They're on plane and they are going. So what is the way to stitch together? I'm gonna drop a whole other thing here on you. Peter Diamandis, VC out of the Bay Area, has long had this concept of exponential organizations. An ideal point to Instagram, which was less than 20 people and sold for $1 billion, because they used off-the-shelf digital tools, to build this crazy network that was so valuable. I'm looking for, how would every independent pivot put themselves out there and can be, engaged directly because a team needs it. Hey, I need someone for 3 weeks. You know what it was like at Extreme or at Labs, which is, hey, I know exactly how to get an app in the App Store. So I get assigned to that team who needs to do that this week. And I get that app in the App Store, and I get assigned to someone else. So I love that model. So how do we bootstrap that? Does it make sense to try a Web3 route to bootstrap a consortium of people who know how to work the same way? Generally, there's this other thing we'll throw in. There's a company called Common Paper, where they have templates for legal documents, and then they publish the template that you click through online. You're like, here is the work model I use. And so I have this crazy fantasy that Common Paper pivots who, I'll use an example of this. I don't want to do any work for hire work. I might do something with a completely permissive open source license, but I am not doing work for hire at all, just period. And so if you're a pivot who is like, hey, I will contract, I won't work for hire, here's my alternative to work for hire, here's the URL where you can actually align, what I offer with what you offer. And then I would imagine that as pivots, we continue to iterate that. And then the consortium is just like standard project under 3 weeks, no equity, click. Standard project, 6 weeks, small equity, whatever. Long project, equity. And so it becomes extremely easy for pivots to transact with each other. So I'm going to say one more thing, which is the Peter Diamandis exponential organization is based on, there was something called Coase's quote unquote law, which was Ronald Coase, an economist, basically said the reason companies get big is because it's cheaper to transact inside a company because of essentially you don't have the drag of a contract. Okay, so his whole point is that's not true anymore. And so while I'm a fan of Diamandis and I like what he's saying, what I really need is a believable path. Okay, if it's easier to transact outside of an organization, how is it easier, right? Like, where is it? What's the path? And so if every pivot had their own contract that was actually breakdownable, like, so if I wanted to hire someone, I'm like, I need someone for 3 weeks who is willing to, whatever, just take salary now or take cash now, no equity, all the way to I need someone who doesn't need cash right now but was willing to work for equity. And imagine, and here I'm in fantasy land, right? But if there were a Ethereum kind of network where you could just bootstrap something like that and then go out and find pivots who want to service that kind of network, that to me sounds like an amazing use of technology.
Yeah, that'd be really cool. I'm not sure if the Web3 part would help or hinder something like that. And then it's like that's an implementation detail in the end. It's like, how do you transact? I think I've always flirted around with, and we never had the time to allocate teams toward this, like what does a better allocations tool kind of look like? I would, in my head, I always wanted to try out the model where, everybody in the organization is kind of there, but they're also required to pair a certain amount of time. And people would kind of have to like pair up. And if you didn't, you would get almost kind of like randomly assigned within your like skill set and everything else. I wonder if an organization had like that where their people were pairing or they're open to pairing, what it meant to bring in specialists into that, right? Like, I know this team is working on this set of problems. They've expressed that they don't have the expertise to maybe go over this hump. Like, how do I like click specialized, pairing person or somebody or somebody who's a specialist is also very good at pairing and communicating and working people through these problems. How do I just like click and let that happen? Or, just have those specialists in the system who are constantly floating around, right? And the system's telling them like, hey, you can't spend more than 4 weeks in this one area.
Yeah. So imagine that the pipeline for pivotal-based consultants is just like that, right? So you would essentially put in a bid. Hey, I have X hours of time a week for the next N weeks. And so you're just essentially in a market. And, thanks for pointing out that it's an implementation DLTL on Web3. I don't want to overly complicate it. But the whole goal of the system is to make transactions a very high trust transaction model. That is, if you are using one of these standard contract models, it's highly legible. Jesse Alford is listening in, right? And so we talk a lot about the legibility of a process. And so I want to make an ultra high legibility process. I am available. I want to do this type of work. Secondary preference is this type of work. Rate request is X. Right. Happy to, you could say, you could actually trip the thing like I will parachute into disasters. Premium for that is X. And so imagine if every pivot who wanted to work independently was just simply legible to that network. Okay, so that allows you to go and build the next level of this fantasy, which is I have long believed that what's missing from especially the software development world is Hollywood-style agents. Like the notion that someone would just pay you the same amount they would pay someone else is almost completely ridiculous. It's just you're a developer, so you get paid. It makes no sense. But that market is not legible to people who pay to have software written. They don't so everyone knows that a big name blockbuster Hollywood star gets paid insanely more because there's very little risk in the property you invest in with them. Right? And so I don't understand how the market has gone this long and software is so incredibly valuable. Like it makes what you make off of a movie look like literally nothing. I don't know about the economics of video games, but aren't video games just like insanely more productive than even a Hollywood movie?
Yeah, that whole world is that's a whole talk in itself. But yeah, it's a bit of a grind. It's a pressure cooker.
But so if I invested $100 million in making a video game and I invested $100 million in making a movie, I would expect to get 1-2x on the movie, and I would expect, I think, a lot more from the video game.
Yeah, there's always that like artistic license of like, you can spend a lot of money and still do a bad job and end up with nothing, right? Just like with any software project.
Yeah.
But yeah, the gaming market is so large these days, right? Especially if we're hitting up all the consoles and platforms and everything else.
Yeah,
it's nuts. I think when it comes to this whole conversation reminds me there was a pivot who was pairing on Twitch for a while. It was an amazing experiment to see them just like working on a problem, kind of get stuck trying to work through it, and seeing the Twitch chat like with suggestions and everything else. Like they ended up stopping doing it because they had to go back to normal work things, and they obviously can't show work code on Twitch. But they made a small game there, and they really appreciated that experience. It was awesome. But yeah, I would love to see a system. I think there's a lot of organizations that are constantly looking for expertise. I feel like there's a lot of organizations that don't even know when they're truly stuck. They just don't know.
Good at it.
And I think it is a very good skill to have somebody in there. So like I think in terms of like an implementation that would work for folks is just like have a retainer for every kind of skilled person that's going through and have them just cycle through your teams. Anybody who's going to, I have a feeling anybody who's going to pay for a solution like that is going to want like a very predictable kind of like, hey, I want to pay this many a year, this many a month to kind of like do my resource allocation and planning and like, financial forecasting and stuff like that. So like if a certain amount of money would guarantee me like a certain amount of like pivots or experienced people kind of cycling through my team, like throughout the year, that works great. And I'll collect feedback from my team and they can kind of cycle around through the organization. I think with the way it works right now is like people are like, I need a Java expert. And like some Java expert will come in and do like, slide decks and like kind of like talk at the team and, work them through a few situations, architectural stuff. But in terms of like sitting down and pairing and working through the day-to-day problems, having somebody cycle through an organization and do that and collect the feedback and, kind of report back would be amazing. I think very fundamentally game changing for a lot of organizations.
Okay, so let me walk through the work scenario, the business scenario here, and you tell me if I'm tracking you. So let's pretend I am a director of development somewhere,
mm-hmm.
and I have as much as one full-time employee's money. And so if believably, if I could subscribe for the cost of one full-time employee to someone who I reliably believe is 5 times more effective than that employee. And so you have to do a sale on that. And so you'd have to sell to people who understand what pairing is as your initial market. Then you have to amp the heck out of whatever they achieve at that market as your follow-on, as your sales follow-on, because you're going to have to reach people who don't know what you're talking about. So the A model would be just to subscribe to a service. And so would you imagine that you would just say, hey, standard full burden cost for a good developer is $250,000 a year, and so you subscribe for $250,000? Is that how you would do it? And then you would get nominal 5x above that because you're cycling people in to solve problems?
Yeah, it kind of gets into I feel like there's a bunch of staffing models that have probably played out that you can lean on to see the outcomes of some of these things. But, when you talk to people and the amount of things they have to worry about for hiring a person and validating their skill set and, going through the interview process and everything else. If all that can be taken that away, or alleviated by saying that like, hey, this person has paired before. They've worked with many teams through like large problems. They know how to they have the skill set. They know they have the track record. And they're just going to be there to help you out. I think that a lot of people would jump on that opportunity, especially if they're experienced. They would jump on that opportunity. There'll be some issues with, like places like in Canada, we get a certain amount of government rebates for like every employee that we hire. So like you have to reason about that and everything else, but those things will always kind of like pop up. But I was helping out a recruiting startup before, and the amount of time and energy over like the 3 to 6 months to hire one person, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of time.
It's completely redonkulous too. So I'm thinking about the use cases. So again, I'm a director of software engineering somewhere. Like I'm not an executive. I have real problems. I don't want to have a dumb, stupid argument. I have real problems I want to solve. So if I'm having a hard time hiring, I might actually just want someone to come in and give me a believable job description and maybe even articulate what my process is. Gosh, how do you sell this, right? How do you position the sale for that? Because
I think if I'm sitting there and I'm looking at my different options, it's like, well, I can hire like a consulting firm, but that always ends up being like a disjointed kind of like you need to hire another full-time person just to keep that consulting firm in sync with your main team, right? They're not actually part of your team as much as they say, and everything else. It always just goes off the rails. Unless you hired Pivotal Labs or Pivotal, we became essentially part of your team, right? That's why that model worked. And this would be like almost like the microservices approach to Pivotal Labs, right? Like instead of doing a very large engagement with a large team and a large contract, like, hey, piecemeal, you can do one at a time and everything else, a little bit more approachable, a lot more predictable, and again, more reliable because I don't have to suss out a consulting firm, what are they good at, what are they not good at. You know that it's going to, generally just work out and be a good outcome. And then I don't have to worry about like the disjointed kind of like A and B, like team A and B, how to keep them in sync and everything else. And the hiring process just like disappeared. I can have somebody on Monday instead of being like, oh, I need to predict that I need somebody in 6 months. I need to start up my hiring pipeline, put out a job posting, go through all the interviews, everything else. And that's if they work out well. I get started in like 3 to 6 months. You can always have the missteps. You have to start over again. It's part of the process.
Yeah. So if I'm that director and I have some acquaintance with Pivotal stuff, like I've worked on a team or I worked at a place where they came in, like I'm going to understand the value. I'm still going to want a standard vetting process, I think. And so I'm going to want some version, like a reverse RPI, essentially. Like I want to know that this person can come in and actually articulate what's going on. We're missing Nat Bennett, who is like to me the person who understands like how to go and map that org. So maybe they'll work out a process there.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, like with every other like service or consulting firm, they'll have an interview process of some kind or a way to reason about this, I think.
Yeah, and so my goal here would be to. I'll never forget listening to who's the big before Spotify. There was the radio station, Pandora. The Pandora was in the Bay Area, and the founder of Pandora came in, and he said, "I'm building this company so that being a musician is a middle class job." The whole point was like, hey, let's get stuff out there. There's great music and it doesn't have distribution. So let's get it distributed and then upvoted and then, paying essentially radio royalties to the people who do the music. I have a very same thing. Like the Pivotal, I say it like this. So if I want to send a pivot into a place, I do want this to be like Hollywood. I want to be the agent like, hey, Mr. or Mrs. Pivot is coming through, and we don't actually bother them with stupid stuff. So if you can't do remote access for new people, don't even call us, right? Because an absolute minimum requirement is you're going to have to be able to get that person online with not garbage, right? So I want to say that. I want to say the kinds of things that they will need access to. They need to understand about the business in order to make something. This is a complex sale, but the insane capacity of pivots allows you to make kinds of promises that are not possible to make in other consulting places. And then here's the real kicker. This is what I really want. You're in the cap table business. Like, how do we all become owners? That's the real thing that I want. Right, so I want someone to go to a place and be able to contribute at this completely outsized value, and then have a tail for that. Some long tail. Maybe it doesn't produce very much, but over your career, if you're receiving a few $100s a month from a bunch of different companies, and maybe this is too deeply into fantasy land, but if you can build these little income tails by doing projects. Right, that's a strategy in Silicon Valley. There are people who just go and work for their first equity award, and then they literally quit. They buy it and they quit. And like, there's this famous guy named Chuck Rossi, who was the one and only delivery lead at Facebook forever. It was one guy who sat on a chat and merged your code into production if you were there. And this guy was merciless. He did that at Facebook. He did that at Google. Where else was he at? He was somewhere else. And so he was collecting these huge equity awards, right? And he was operations guy too. So I was Chucker. I love Chuck Rossi. I want that same thing for everyone. Like, it just makes sense. Pivots have way high capacity. Okay. And so now we're at the foot of the next revolution. Like,
yeah. So I think there's like it's a very interesting and very multifaceted solution. I'm not sure how you get there in a meaningful way in some of these organizations without providing like the full solution, almost like a Pivotal Labs or more, right? I think like the working for equity, I'll talk to that first. I think that's definitely a model that a lot of people were able to benefit from a while ago. Now what we're seeing is like the financial savviness around equity now is like people showed up to our platform. They're like, no. We don't want to see numbers of options. We want to see dollars. Like, I want to know exactly how much I'm paying somebody in terms of options. And I want to know it for like these many exit scenarios, right? So that they know that like everything is controlled and in check and everything else. So I'm not sure, like, I think that still happens, but I'm not sure if it's as prevalent. And then, like for a model like this, like I do worry, like sometimes I've seen in like some of these big organizations, like sometimes it's like the team needs help, but sometimes the whole organization needs help, right? And like, what do you do in those situations where like, hey, somebody's like puts a person into an impossible situation, like and like then nobody's having fun, right? Then you need to go through the whole leadership stack and be like, what's going on? They might be not be open to it. Like these are all consulting problems that we all faced during that whole thing, right?
100%. I just the notion that a large organization can make rational decisions is a flaw, and so, well, I still think there's some route here, which is they will buy point solutions. And so when we were at Cloud Foundry, I would always talk about the pivotal model as essentially grass plugs model. We just go to a place, whoever will talk to us, we'll plant a grass plug there. And if we're successful at all, we will network out. So we'll literally run a viral marketing campaign internally. You know, when we put up CI boards, are you aware of this thing in Cloud Foundry? When you put up a CI board, you go to some large bank or whatever, and you work with a team, and you're like, hey, you guys got to get a TV up here so we can actually see the CI system.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That is like a lightning bolt in the middle of that. People are walking by like, well, why do they have a TV? Like, what are they doing with it? And you just point it out like, oh, that's exactly what we're doing. And we can see, and they're like, well, I want one of those. And so it literally becomes a viral marketing campaign. And I just always refer to it as grass plugs. We either were going to spread out like that and those grass plugs were going to grow together, or we weren't, right? I mean, it's just a strategy, and you don't get a guarantee on the return.
Yes. I definitely believe at that level, yeah, like definitely could be like the osmosis of affecting the people next to you in that way is definitely super powerful, especially when people see like the good feedback or like another team being productive, like definitely gonna do it. And by the way, I've never ordered more TVs in my life than when I was at Pivotal. We had so many TVs in every office.
Yeah.
And every customer loved them. They love walking around the office and seeing all these pipelines and actually seeing the progress of their teams. You know, even if it is like the automated things and commits going through, like they love seeing the physical process of things just like going. They felt like it was more alive. They could see the progress. They're like, oh, things are moving. It's not just a bunch of people. And without the context of like as an engineer, if you're, you know, somebody who doesn't understand like what, like where individual teams are sitting and what they're working on, you can't just look at a group and be like, I don't know what's going on, right? Like these people like doing this or that. But the screen kind of helped bridge that gap, which was really, really good. I think that some of the organizational things that, when I think about like some of our past engagements, one example is, when a large organization has the wrong incentives and it's driving teams to do really like, bad practices. Until you fix those incentives, a problem like that essentially won't get fixed, and somebody at the team level couldn't fix that problem. So those are the kind of scenarios that I've seen in like in some organizations where those are a much bigger leadership heavy thing to fix.
Yeah, and I mean, we've seen a good transformation just stop dead in its tracks. Sometimes because facilities people are like, two people are not allowed to sit at the same desk.
Yep. Yeah. It's like, and there's been engagements like Extreme Labs and Pivotal side that we had to pull out, right? Because we're just like, we're not setting this thing up for success, and that's it, right?
Yeah.
So.
Okay, well, let's see if we can get to the current revolution. So I'll try not to prejudice it. The ChatGPT was released November 30th, 2022.
Mm-hmm.
Well, do you have a specific memory of that release, and what has been your impression as we're going forward in time here to October?
So I've always flirted around with the idea. So I was playing around with models a few years before ChatGPT came out, and I was always trying to like solve this problem, right? Like as an engineer, I noticed myself and the teams around me repeating a lot of patterns, and I'm like, having the mentality of like, if you're not automating yourself out of a job, somebody else is going to do it, right? So constantly looking at it, like I was trying all these natural language solutions and making up my own frameworks. I was just like, oh, I want to like tell a story and have it turn into code and everything else, right? And that naturally led me down to models. So I was playing around with a bunch of different models, loading them onto phones and everything else. I never got to the level of like developing my own LLM or anything else. Not anywhere close, right? I did learn enough to know the boundaries of the problem, why it's hard, and the amount of effort and what to expect out of it, more or less. I think the word AI just gets thrown around. It actually means a bunch of different things. And so when ChatGPT came out, I was just like, this is the thing I've been thinking about, dreaming about, right? I know it's not going to be perfect the first time around, but it's going to be a huge deal. And it is. It's getting there. I think a lot of people looking from the outside in on this industry, they're like, oh, a bunch of people are going to lose their jobs. I'm like, no, it's just going to assist a lot of people in their jobs and help them think through a bunch of things or give them like a second opinion. We're personally using it in a bunch of different ways in our solution. But the most valuable part right now is using AI to understand unstructured data and get insights from it. It's almost like a next gen OCR. So that's been very good for us. We're keeping an eye on all the generative stuff. That's where it starts getting a little bit like, okay, there's all these lawsuits and, people are starting to reason about it and everything else. So we have a few experiments there, not exposed to customers, but we're keeping a close eye on that and on the development side for helping us like reason about code as well.
Yeah. So you've got skin in the game here. So what does the industry look like in 3 years? And I mean the software development industry. I mean, I often, everyone wants to think about the best, new tech coming out, but software development to me is really done in Fortune 500s, 2,000 person organizations. They're producing a lot of software. So what's the track for the next couple of years for that kind of organization?
With AI, I think it's going to touch so many aspects. And a lot of this stuff is already happening now. It's just not perfect. I've access to a few pre-released tools on the Google side. You can see the progress. But having a AI understand all of your code bases and be like, hey, I need to understand how this one function works. And it's like, oh, it actually goes to this. And then that talks to this API and that jumps to this code base and everything else. That's great. Having
how
like
many years? How many years? That's what I call the reverse Borg scenario.
Mhm.
It's just like, okay, we'll just lay a structure over everything, right? And then you come to what Google built from the ground up in Borg. You just come from the top down. You just can lay things over it. So when you think about that, how many years out is that for you?
Probably another year or two. It's not too far out.
Yeah, a year or two. Like, so this industry, which has always, prided itself on moving quickly. I remember when product cycles were a decade, and then product cycles became 7 and then 5 and then 3. But we're talking about you're just like casually talking about a wholesale complete revolution in 2 years.
Oh yeah, for a lot of our document parsing, so a lot of the models would have a limit on input tokens or characters, and they were limited at like I think it was ChatGPT has been increasing their limits a lot, but they'd be capped at like when I was first using the Google stuff is 4K characters, which means when I have to put in a whole document, I'm like, okay, now I need to do a vector database, I need embeddings, I need to do a search against, either semantics or whatever parameter I want, grab that text bit, put it into a prompt, give it to the model, and it's done. And like forward to, that was like a few months, that was like in June or something like that. And forward today, like Google unveils 32K, character input. Now I'm just like, oh, I just got rid of my whole tech stack. I'm just putting it directly into the model. And that was over 3 months. Go forward another year, you're going to be able to put in full code bases. You're going to be able to ask questions. Again, it's not going to replace anybody like be perfect at these things, but the amount of acceleration for like, if I had to go through like 10 code bases and figure out how they're all stitched together, that would take me a lot longer probably than if I asked LLM, and it kind of helped me, like assisted me through that journey. Where I get really excited is this, like having an LLM look at like a whole code base, especially one that's trained on like code. It'd be like, how do I refactor? Like if I wanted to refactor it this way, or if I wanted to refactor it that way, or like, hey, in our roadmap we're going in this direction. Do you have suggestions on like how to re-architect things? Like letting the ideas flow and just suggest things in that way to be really, really, really cool.
Yeah, so that's an exciting idea. But as soon as you hit that, what you realize you're going to be able to do is say, these 50 code bases, find the databases they access, and then unify the database access across every single one of them, the same exact code block. And if it has to be in a different language, you render it in that code block. By the way, instrument that. It all goes here. And you're just going to refactor, like forget about it. Like Facebook 7 years ago had 6 things that they could fix in code bases automatically. And it was like it was very specific PHP stuff mostly. They could find this kind of error that would happen in PHP a lot because they just trained it on the code base of broken stuff, right? And so they could correct these things, but we're not this whole concept of grokking what's going on. We're going to be there for 3 months. Like, oh, this is really cool. It's like, forget it. You're not, you don't grok, you do, but most people don't even grok how their car works. Like there is basic input and output controls, and that's all anyone is ever going to see. And this is not a surprise, but this because we're, I like to think we're 1,000 abstractions above the sand, that trickles electrons through it that actually run our universe. We're 1,000 or more levels above that. We just hit like photosynthesis. I think the AI revolution is as big as fire, and I say that with no at all irony. Like we're just going to be able to send things out, probes out to the entire solar system. We're going to be able to map everything with impressions. Oh, the solar wind is particularly nice today. I love this. Like the robots are just going to be telling us these things. Yeah. So it's super interesting. We didn't have a direct conversation about like the speed, but the speed to me is the critical thing. And
it's huge.
If we tie all of this together, pivots are the trained core of people who are most likely to not be surprised, to be able to follow essentially your temperamental example of no need to freak out. Like we'll solve this problem, but in fact, it only makes sense to try to solve this problem in a short iteration. Because in the 90s, part of your engineering model would be this machine is too slow. But we know in 2 years when the growth hits, we'll be able to buy a bigger machine. So there was this whole universe where you counted on Intel, literally, in RAM price drops in your engineering model. That fell away. That fell away by the early 2000s, and cloud, totally obliterated that. But now the speed because at some point these things are going to turn around and start consuming themselves, and then they're just going to map the full embedding space. They're like, like there's this mathematical concept called braid groups, which it's just like braiding hair or bread or anything like that. Braid groups, and basically braid groups just tell you where stuff can probably occur. And so now the entire embedding space can just be run mathematically. Like, well, it's like AlphaGo. Did you follow that whole thing?
Yep.
Right. The people observing it are like, this thing thinks like no human has ever thought about Go.
Yep.
And so you could just think of it. It mapped the entire embedding space of Go and explored solutions there. This same 2-year thing in the lab is going to mean they are going to turn specialized machines with sensors loose on the entire embedding space to fill it in.
Yeah, no, it's going to be massive, and I think like tangibly for me when I think about this problem, I'm like, okay, like an LLM is going to have access to our whole code base. It's going to tell me how to refactor. It's going to really understand what I'm doing, or what the code is. It's not going to understand my intent until I kind of like put it in there. At the point where it can kind of tell me to like give me suggestions on how to refactor my code, it can also get to the point of how to switch the whole code base. Right. And the huge problem with that is like, I've tried this before, is like all the libraries never translate. I've had ChatGPT and every LLM under the sun recommend horrible, code snippets, but especially libraries. It's like, hey, use this popular library. It doesn't work or has a bad license and everything else. Right. And those will be problems that will be sorted out over time, or you can kind of tune your model to do different things.
Already sorted. I have a friend who is a very good programmer, but he's a solo guy. And he's now working with the machine alone. He's like, I don't like this Node.js library. And he just had it re-render into whatever language he wanted.
Yeah.
And that the whole point is the machine will just be able to define your path to production. It's like,
yes,
give me access to logs, give me access to the code base, and I can tell you what you are doing. I can define the electron path from client to client, right? The entire loop.
Yeah.
Then you're just like, well, render me that loop in something that's highly legible and short. It's like, and that entire code base will simply be subsumed by the rising tide. It will just vanish because all we care about is essentially the path that electrons are taking through this thing.
Yeah. And this is the thought pattern that took me down the natural language thing as well. So it's like, if it's be able to refactor and change code, right? Then you get to a point where I kind of marry it with the data that I had with startups after VMware. I helped a whole bunch of people bootstrap their startups. I just wanted to help the people in my network do well. I had the time. I was going to take a year of vacation, but I got restless, and I'm like, okay, I'll help people bootstrap and not become full employees, but just help them out. A lot of them start off with Node. There's Node and React, because like I need to hire, and I need to hire reliably. If I go into like Rust, people are going to be more expensive. I can't find them. Everything else, so like I'm just going to start off on Node and React, and I'll deal with the consequences later. Twitter had this thing too. They all started on Ruby. They needed to make certain things performant. They moved off into other languages and optimized later. When I kind of marry the AI thing, the startup approach, and then what we did at Cloud Foundry, I'm like, what if everybody's writing in Node and cloud, like something like the cloud application platform, just really knows like, hey, I need to hit this many requests per second. Oh, I'm going to switch that whole code base into Rust. It'll still work. I need to make sure these tests pass. And, maybe it'll do a whole bunch of UI tests as well. But even if it had to iterate 20 times before it got to a working copy, it would still be way more cost effective than having a whole team think about that, right?
Yeah, you could dump it to a cloud provider. Like spend $25,000 on getting it refactored. Like,
Easy.
What do you care, right? Like what f, right? Like, right. And then you do the vector embeddings of what it is.
Yep.
And then you just render it into assembler. Like that's the whole thing. Is we're going to just go back. Like just render this in assembler. Who cares?
Yeah. And then the cloud providers don't need to support all these different languages and versions and everything else. People are more expressing what they want the machine to do in whatever natural way they want, which I landed in like a natural language thing was a horrible idea. That has to be something, not YAML, anything but YAML for anybody who's listening. I don't want to go back down the YAML enterprise thing. Yeah, like you can definitely see the stuff creeping up super quickly. And especially thinking about all the application transform projects that we had back in the day, like switching things from like Java to something else or some whatever.
Right,
you can see AI's
gig heap Java app.
Oh yeah, it's a huge team, big project, all these plans. Like if I was one of those executives, I would pay an LLM or whatever solution to just hammer on that for like a month, get to a good outcome that satisfies all of our needs. And again, it's not going to get it right the first time, but when you think about the cost and the mind share and what people could be working on in terms of newer and net new initiatives for customers and outcomes versus kind of refactoring and changing something that's already there, it's almost like it's a no-brainer. Like if whoever creates that or whenever somebody creates that, it's going to happen within a very short time. Like people will jump on that, no problem. Yeah. It'd be a huge time savings, cost savings.
So jump out. You started on Cloud Foundry in 2012, 2013?
2013, yeah.
2013.
October.
So 10 years ago, we did Cloud Foundry essentially, and it was a pioneering effort, right? There wasn't a market for it. We went out and did it. And we look back, and there's nothing except for Kubernetes. There's nothing really shocking. Kubernetes to me is a distraction. Like I get that it's a cool piece of tech, but it's not actually a business piece of tech.
Mm-hmm.
All right. 10 years out from now, 2033, what do you see?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've seen people try to move away from the Cloud Foundry kind of aspect, mostly because like support is getting a little scarce out there these days. And they just crave it, right? Like anything that kind of puts your business intents at the interface and deals with the rest for you. People just love that, right? They'll eat that up all day, every day. I just do think that the abstraction layer of intent, like for Cloud Foundry, was code, which is perfect, right? Like here's my code, here's my intent. I just need you to run it.
Okay, wait. I want you to break down the abstraction layer of intent. So give us a technical definition of how you think about that.
Essentially, in like when we're pushing something to a Cloud Foundry or just writing code in general, we're saying like, hey, we want to be able to talk to these inputs this way. It could be the customer, it could be an API or anything else. We have this logic of how we want to reason about those inputs, and then we want to give essentially responses or do something. I think the way we express that intent to a system is going to become a lot more accessible to people. So you don't have to learn Go and the whole syntax and everything else. Again, like people they gravitate to a JavaScript because it's a lot less strict than other things, right? I think that is going to become a lot more accessible to people. And the complexity at the other side of what happens, again, with like AI transformations and everything else, it's going to become way, way, way more complex. I do agree with you with Kubernetes. I feel like that's a step backwards. And you can talk to a lot of Cloud Foundry customers. They also feel like they really love that interface. I think that'll come back. The industry will wise up to that, come back and build those abstraction layers on top of it again, the more opinionated stuff. it's just a matter of time, right? I think it's literally the way we evolve solutions as the human species is to get closer to just capturing people's intent and just making the process as easy as possible.
Yeah,
right?
The elimination of toil, the ultra expressiveness.
Yeah, I think anything that I always use Amazon as the prime example, and I don't think this is always like a good outcome for humanity, because some of it leads into like human behavior and some people try to exploit it. But Amazon like really lent into somebody wants a product, we are going to get it to them as soon as possible, no matter what the cost, and the human convenience will win out at the end of the day. And I think that's what Cloud Foundry did for folks, right? I don't have to think about the container networking of it or anything else. I just said like, hey, I have this application, I want to run it. It can talk to the other application. I need to access another API. We would do all the internal networking. That interface is very valuable to folks.
Yeah. Okay, so 10 years out, you see just essentially expression of intent. And so what do you see for the stack, right? So we'll just take a totally classic example. In a lot of places, there is a product organization. It doesn't look like the pivotal product organizations, but it's like product. Like, hey, clients need this. Are they going to be the only ones employed at that point?
No. I there will always be. I think you'll find people are just working on net new architectures and ideas versus being stuck in toil. Right. I was talking to a friend who said one of his teams, or not one of his teams, another team in their organization, they spent a year switching their code base from Ruby to Rust. At the end of the year, it turns out that Ruby got so much better throughout that 1 year that they actually gained nothing from it.
Yeah,
right?
In 2023, I don't think you can recommend a rewrite on any basis at all.
Yeah, so it's like it's one of those things where it's like, well, if an LLM was there, they'd probably like try it out a whole bunch of different times, try it a bunch of different languages, give you the benchmarks, and just give you a suggestion of what to do. And while that for that whole year, that whole team could have been like, what about new customers? What about new experiences? How do we drive that forward, right? And there'll be other AI tools to help with that process, but like having people just removing toil for people in general, right? I think even when we look at like just the basics of everyday life that we take for granted these days, right? Like proper plumbing. You go back long enough, like people had to worry about, plumbing. What are we going to do about it? How are we getting water? That was part of the daily routine. Now we have a lot more time to focus on other things, right? Hopefully not TikTok too much for folks. I don't do TikTok, but like I sometimes look around at like some of the tech around us, and I'm like, yeah, I'm happy I don't have to worry about that stuff. I can focus on businesses, moving things forward, and helping people out, and spending more time with folks.
Yeah. Well, I trust that this revolution is going to deliver something like that too, and I do hope it doesn't go the TikTok route. I think we probably had long discussions on my beliefs about social media and the influence. We will save that one for another time.
Yeah,
we've been going for an hour and 40 minutes. Great conversation, Dwayne. This is a great place to wrap. Any final things that you want to tell our audience?
I think. Oh, parting words, always so tough. I truly believe that having strong opinions loosely held. I think if there was one thing that I've always worked on and appreciated for the people around me when we're working on problems, just constantly working on that, right?
Yep.
Because for different personality types, you have to approach that in different ways, and that's a skill in its own. And it's by far the best skill you could have, by far.
We'll do a separate discussion on that. All right. Give us the plug for Mantle.
Oh, I mean, yeah, go to withmantle.com. We're here to really just help out founders, businesses, operators, just so that we can automate all that stuff away and have them just focus on their business more.
Right.
All the paperwork and toil.
And if you're a pivot and you're in an equity situation, tell them about Mantle for freeze.
Yeah.
For now.
Yep.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining Radio Free XP today. Today is October 4th. Our guest has been Dwayne Forde. Dwayne, thanks so much for coming on. And, I hope that you'll be a regular guest. I love talking to you about your point of view and just how you think about things.
No, thanks for having me. And I'm happy to come back anytime. I love it. I love all of our conversations.
Perfect. We'll talk to you next time.
Take it easy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free XP. If you're interested in helping with graphics, bumper music, or other aspects of production, or if you'd like to be on the show, please contact Jesse Alford or Tony Hansmann on the Pivotal Alum Slack. You can also reach us via email at jesse.alford@pm.me or precept@gmail.com, respectively.